All right. So before we get started here, um, couple things I wanted to mention. So this morning I put up another practice exam, or at least close to it. I don't think it has quite 30 questions, but another set of questions that'll be helpful to go through when preparing for the final exam next Tuesday. So you'll now kind of see that second set of practice exam questions. Everything should be up to date on Canvas in terms of dropping your lowest module reading, your 4 lowest in-class quizzes, your lowest 2 module quiz scores. So the only thing that shouldn't be up to date will be that final Canvas discussion, which is due at the end of the week. Now, you can probably kind of figure out if you put a good faith effort in, you're generally getting the majority of, 20 out of 20. So you can kind of calculate what your grade in that category would be. It's basically your total points across the 5 assignments out of 100. Right? That would be your percentage grade in that category. So those won't be updated until after that due date passes on Friday. But you kind of know like where you're going to stand if you complete that 5th and final Canvas discussion. You would then be able to use, I think I mentioned this last week as well, but I put the link up under this final exam materials. You could then download this Excel file, put in your score for these various categories, including your first 2 exam scores, your CL points, which I will get those updated when I get back to my office this afternoon. I'll then update them again tomorrow. I think all the CL laters from last night got them entered in, but just in case, I'll update them again tomorrow if some of them were planning on doing that today. So you should kind of know where you stand. You can play around with hypothetical grades on that final exam to then see what your final score in the course would be, okay? So it takes kind of all of those grades you see in Canvas. You can put in hypothetical grades for that final exam. It adds in your CL points and tells you what your final score in the class would be. Okay, so you have that up there as well. Other than that, so the CL sessions up to this point, the highest possible, once I update them this afternoon, the highest number you could have is what 1.65, I think, extra credit points. I have it set at 1.8 because this Thursday there's going to be extra available CL sessions, which I was saying I hope that I would be able to have them. I've coordinated with my undergraduate instructors. There was enough of them where every time slot will have 2 locations this Thursday. So an additional CL session this Thursday for extra credit if you want to attend those. I'll get up an announcement later this afternoon on Canvas that says exactly what those locations are. It's the same locations as before. It's just that there's only 2 at each time slot, so one of them wouldn't be available. So I'll get up that information this afternoon on Canvas. If you want to attend a CL session on Thursday, that's essentially an additional week of attending a CL session or an additional 0.15 points of extra credit you could get added in. Okay? So I'll get that up there on Canvas later this afternoon. My office hours, my last final office hours will be tomorrow. So I thought more people would stop by yesterday than they did. But I have office hours tomorrow as it's kind of regularly scheduled, 10 to 1. I'll have the Zoom link pulled open. They might get kind of busy whenever you sign on to Zoom, wherever you're at, kind of in terms of the line of students. That's where I kind of plug you in. So I apologize if you get on Zoom and you have to wait a while. It's just like people, if you showed up and there was people in front of you, you'd have to wait in person as well. Okay. So there's office hours. I want to mention that. CL sessions, practice exam, updating CL points. The only other thing I wanted to mention, and I'll get an announcement up about this. So I think I mentioned on Thursday, thought we were going to be split for the final between 2 rooms. We kind of are. We have 2 room locations, but one of them is only 10 seats short of being able to accommodate the class. How the hell the people who were scheduling this did this, I don't know. But we will be in Hodge Hall room 2075. That's where the vast majority of you will be at. I need to look through the roster. I'm only going to have about 20 students in the other room, right? So the other room is right next to it. I think it's 2083. So I'll get this up in an announcement on Canvas. But the vast majority of you will be in room 2075 when? Next Tuesday, a week from today, from 5:20 to 7:20 p.m. Okay? That's the date and time of our final. I didn't choose it. That's what it is. At the same time, I have another section taking an exam on the first floor of Hodge Hall. So my plan is to likely start with you guys getting the exams handed out and then I will probably leave and go make sure everything is okay over there, and I'll bounce back and forth between the two rooms. But your room will have 3 TAs in it, even when I'm not there. So there'll be people there who can answer questions at any point during the exam. If you have a question that you really want to ask me, like I said, I'll be kind of roaming between the classroom or the two sections, okay? It's a little bit different in the midterm because they're running, my sections are running simultaneously, but I will be kind of back and forth there, okay? Like I said, I think the additional room, like the 20 of you that won't be in 2075, but 2083, it's probably going to be like last names, I don't know, X through Z, or just the kind of last few letters of the alphabet. But I'll have an announcement up on Canvas that exactly identifies where that cutoff would be, and I'll announce it again in class on Thursday, okay? We're just trying to give you a little bit more information as we're leading up into that final. Any logistical questions for me before we jump into material here today? Okay, so one thing I did want to reiterate about those CL sessions on Thursday, they don't have a preset agenda. It's basically, instead of like a CL session, I would think about it as a tutor, like a help session that you can go to and ask questions where you can get extra credit for it, right? So they don't have like a list or anything from me. They're going to basically just be there to answer questions if you have them, okay? All right, any questions for me logistically before we kind of jump into just doing review today? And then Thursday, we'll just be doing more review as well. Okay? All right, perfect. So I've got the practice final pulled open. If you have questions over old quizzes or old practice problems, we can go through those as well. I got a couple emails. I had that module 13 quiz, so you couldn't see your results until the due date passed. You should now be able to go in and view your quiz results and see which questions you got wrong and what the correct answer is, okay? Any questions people want to start out with here? Yeah. Yeah. Which one? Yeah. So if I remember right, this is a word problem. You're given price, average total, average variable, cost, etc. Okay? So I'm going to draw a graph because anytime you're working through these problems, if you see a graph question, I could probably turn that into a word problem. If you see a word problem question, it could be turned into a graph, right? They're all kind of linked. So in this one, we are told that the current quantity that the firm is choosing is 10. Marginal revenue and marginal costs are both 20, which that's good because firms should be choosing the quantity that maximizes profits based off of where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, right? We then have the average total and the average variable cost. So if I'm thinking about a graphical representation of what a monopolistically competitive firm faces, it's going to look something like this, right? So I've got the quantity that the firm is choosing. I've got their price. They face a downward sloping demand curve, upward sloping marginal cost, twice as steep marginal revenue curve, okay? Now, before I start adding things into the graph, right, let's think about what we have. If I'm operating and I stay open, my profit equation is what? The quantity I'm selling times the difference between price and average total cost, okay? So we need to know this going into the final, right? Now, here, I could think about, okay, I was told that the quantity that maximizes profits was 10 units, and that was the last quantity where marginal revenue was equal to marginal cost at 20. I was given that information. Now, if I didn't want to draw this out, I was simply told that, okay, my quantity is 10, the price is 40, right? So I would have went up to my demand curve to find that price, right? And I think the question told us the average total cost was 55. So if I calculate my profits, I would get what? Negative 150 here. Now here's where I have to be careful because what did I forget? Well, if I have negative profits, how did I know they were going to be negative first of all? Even if I didn't have this visual eventually my visual depiction, if price is ever below average total cost, what's going to be true about this difference? It's negative, so my profits will always be negative. Sure enough, I calculated them, I get negative profits. So I now have a decision to make. If profits are negative, I need to determine if I shut down to minimize my losses or stay open. So this was my profit equation if I stayed open, okay? If I instead choose to shut down, what are my profits? Simply negative whatever my fixed costs are, right? Now, another way that we kind of wrote this was it's the quantity I'm selling times my average fixed costs, which, how would I determine average fixed costs if I'm not given them? It's simply the difference between my average total and my average variable, okay? So in the problem, I was told the quantity they're producing is 10. At that point, average total cost is 55, and I believe my average variable costs were told to me to be 45, okay? So if I go ahead and calculate this, I get negative 100. Now, how do I know if I should choose the first or second equation? It's going to be based off of not if price is above or below average total. If I'm determining whether or not I shut down, we said I'll choose to shut down if price is ever below what? Average variable, which in the problem, I was told the price is 40 and I was told my average variable cost was 45. So I should have been shutting down, right? And the values convinced me of that. If I stayed open, what were my profits? Negative 150. If I shut down, what were they? Negative 100, which is better, losing 150 or losing 100? Losing 100, right? So we would use that kind of shutdown rule to then identify, okay, I need to shut down and my profits will simply be negative my fixed costs. To find my fixed costs, I would be able to look at a graph and simply look at the difference at any quantity between my average total and average variable cost. So if I wanted to add those cost curves in here, I know that my price of 40 was below the average total cost of 55. So if I stayed open, my profits were the difference between price, average total cost, times the quantity I'm producing. So these were my profits, which were negative, so they were my losses, right? If instead I think about, okay, I was also told that average variable cost, which I know average variable will always be below average total, right? Because average total is just my average variable plus my average fixed. So I was also told that that price is below my average fixed of 45. So I should have been shutting down. If I shut down, my profits would simply be the quantity I'm selling times the difference between average total and average variable cost. So notice visually that blue rectangle is smaller than the red rectangle, or my losses if I shut down are less than my losses and if I stayed open. Right? And the reason why is because anytime price is below average variable cost, this rectangle or these losses are going to be larger values. Okay? So I need to make sure, first of all, if I'm looking at this, I was told the price and I was told average total cost. If price is below average total cost, what answers should I cross out right away? Anything that is, if price is below average total cost, I know my profits are negative, so I should have crossed out 0. If I had any other distracting answers that were positive, what should I do? Cross those out right away as well. So just test-taking techniques. Let's say instead I had like negative, I don't know, maybe I gave you 6 answers. Maybe I had positive 100 and positive 150 in here as well. To make sure I don't forget that negative sign, maybe before I even go to calculate profits, I know price is below average total cost. I should right away cross out anything that's positive. I know that can't be the answer, right? That way, then when I go to actually do the math, if I forget the negative sign, or I'm doing this on a calculator and I just don't see it or something, oh, well, yeah, I got 100 is the answer, but it can't be 100, it has to be negative 100. Price was below average total cost, my profits must be negative, okay? Now, if I ever have price being below average total cost and I know my profits are negative, what's the next thing I need to check? Do I stay open or shut down? How do I determine that? It's if my price is above or below average variable cost. Here it was below, so if price is below average variable cost, I know I should simply shut down, okay? So there's kind of like multiple decisions I have to make within the same problem here. Now, if I ever have price being above average total cost, do I have to check if I shut down? Profits are positive. Am I going to shut down? No. right? So that makes it a little bit easier, right? Wasn't the case in this problem, right? But I'm just trying to add some concepts in that might be helpful as you're studying for the final, okay? Because I could change, right? I could have this exact same problem. If I told you the price was 60, right away, you know profits are positive. If I know that they're positive, I know I should stay open, and I simply calculate my profits using this equation, okay? Excuse me. Any other questions on that one? Okay. Any other problems people want to see kind of work through? Yeah. On the quiz or on practice? Yeah. So when we're talking about excess capacity, right, our definition of excess capacity is we're comparing where the monopolistically competitive market is relative to where the perfectly competitive market will be in the long run, okay? So I can think of this initially as it's the price that that perfectly competitive market is going to choose in the long run minus that quantity the monopolistically competitive firm is choosing. Now, if I have a perfectly competitive market, we said, what will profits be in the long run? We've got to know this going in, 0, right? So I'll kind of draw a difference here. So this was like, here was like what the firm was choosing. Here we'll think about the quantity in the market. So when a firm makes a choice, a perfectly competitive firm, their marginal revenue curve is simply whatever the equilibrium price is, right? So let's say I had a scenario that looks something like this. Here's my supply and demand curve. And initially, that equilibrium price, where supply is equal to demand, is right here in the market. That becomes the firm's marginal revenue curve if I have a perfectly competitive market. Okay? If that's the case, what does a perfectly competitive firm do? Choose the optimal quantity where? Marginal cost is equal. Every single market, the firm makes their profit maximizing quantity decision where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue. However, they don't set the price, they're taking the price as given. What's true about price relative to average total cost? Price is less than average total cost, so my profits are negative. What will firms do in response to that? Some firms will choose to, profits are negative. Some firms will get the hell out of there, right? They're going to exit the market. If they exit the market, what happens to market supply? Fewer firms. Once again, this is not a cumulative exam, but we need to know that when we have fewer firms, supply was like the sum of all firms, so my supply curve is going to decrease, which is going to do what? Increase that equilibrium price until that new equilibrium price, which is the firm's marginal revenue curve, hits marginal cost exactly at that minimum point of the average total cost curve, and profits become now 0, right? So we know in the long run, where are perfectly competitive firms going to end up? At the minimum point of the average total cost curve. Or we said that quantity also represents, remember I used a term for this, so we had like, this is the minimum point of average total cost. We also call this the efficient scale of production. It's where I've got my per unit cost as low as possible. So we know that's where perfectly competitive markets are going to end up. Okay. So when we're talking about excess capacity, that quantity is where the perfectly competitive market ends up in the long run. That minimum point of the average total cost curve. So when I'm talking about excess capacity, what quantity would that be at in this depiction? Well, average total cost is this yellow curve, so it's right at a quantity of 28. Now, if this was a monopolistically competitive market, they don't make a decision based off of a horizontal demand curve. Once again, I'll add some things in that might be helpful on the exam. If I have a perfectly competitive market and its demand curve is horizontal, we would say that it's perfectly elastic. All the products are the same. I don't care where I buy it from. Monopolistically competitive markets don't face a horizontal demand curve. They can differentiate their products, so their product becomes a little bit more inelastic, or their demand curve is steeper, downward sloping. So where would the monopolistically competitive firm choose? Where there's downward sloping demand curve, which results in a twice as steep marginal revenue curve, where that marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, right? Same decision, it's just they're facing a different marginal revenue curve than a perfectly competitive market or a perfectly competitive firm. So where does the monopolistically competitive firm choose to be? At a quantity of 18. So comparing that to where the long run perfectly competitive firm would be, 28, that excess capacity is 10. Okay. Does that answer the first part of your question? Yeah. So I introduced that idea on Tuesday's class. What did I then say last Thursday? We're going to add on to it, right? We're going to change it a little bit. Because in the long run, we can think about, you could have a depiction where those two values are the exact same thing, right? What's more likely going to be the case, and here's where it's a difference between when we're talking about excess capacity versus calculating deadweight loss. So I'll go through an example of deadweight loss in a second. When we're talking about excess capacity, it's where is the monopolistically competitive firm currently relative to where a perfectly competitive firm would be at in the long run, right? And so that point we're always going to be comparing to is that minimum point of our average total cost curve. Okay? So the definition of excess capacity will always be where the monopolistically competitive firm is currently choosing the quantity relative to that minimum point of the average total cost curve. Okay? Now my markup is the difference between what? Price and marginal cost. So here, what would the markup of a perfectly competitive firm always be? If I had a perfectly competitive firm, price is always going to be exactly equal to, well, price is my marginal revenue. So if marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, price will always be equal to marginal cost, and my markup will be 0. Once I gain some monopoly power, I can have a markup above what it cost me, or I can charge a price higher than what it cost me to produce this good. So here, what is the marginal cost for the monopolistic competitive firm? At that profit maximizing quantity, it looks like it is 10. The price they set, well, they go up to the demand curve. So remember, I'm choosing the quantity in monopolistically competitive and monopoly markets where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. I then set the price by doing what? Going up to the demand curve. So price will always be above marginal cost. So if price is above marginal cost with a monopolistic competitive market, my markup will always be positive. So the markup is higher in a monopolistic competitive market. It actually exists. Okay? So here, what is my marginal cost? 10. The price I set would be equal to 60. So my markup is 50. Okay? So relative to a perfectly competitive market, monopolistically competitive markups will always be higher or lower. This is a question I could ask you on the final. A perfectly competitive markup would be what? Is there a difference between price and marginal cost for the monopolistic competitive firm? Yes. So their markup is positive, so their markup is always higher. Okay? So I think to maybe your other part of this question was it's actually not on 7. You're probably thinking more of something like question 9, right? How do I calculate my deadweight loss? So when calculating deadweight loss, my excess capacity can sometimes be the same thing as what we're going to use as the base of the triangle that would represent deadweight loss. But it's not quite the same thing. So if I'm thinking about, it doesn't always have to be the same thing. So if I'm thinking about a monopolistically competitive market, when I'm calculating deadweight loss, I've got a demand curve, I've got a twice as steep marginal revenue curve, I've got my marginal costs. I set the quantity where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. I go up here to set that price. So I can think about if this was instead a perfectly competitive firm, but they faced this demand curve. We know in practice a perfectly competitive firm will face what demand curve? Horizontal. So it's a little bit different because when we're doing excess capacity, we know that the perfectly competitive firm faces a different demand curve. When calculating deadweight loss, we're saying if the perfectly competitive firm did face this demand curve, then what would be the optimal quantity? So if they did face this demand curve, if I was a perfectly competitive firm, I don't face a twice as steep marginal revenue curve. I simply set in a perfectly competitive market, where's the equilibrium quantity? Where supply is equal to demand. Or in this case, this is the demand the firm faces. What would be the supply curve of the firm? Their marginal cost. Where would the perfectly competitive firm set the price and quantity? Where supply is equal to demand. So that would be at a higher quantity and a lower price. Okay. So if this was a perfectly competitive market, we would be out here at this quantity, but we've got a monopolistically competitive market. They're restricting quantity. So all of these units here, what surplus is lost? Total surplus is simply the difference between the marginal benefits and marginal costs in the market. What represents the marginal benefits in the market? The demand curve. What represents the marginal costs? Our supply curve. So the difference between that supply and demand curve for all these units that we no longer see being produced, this would be a loss of surplus or our deadweight loss, which is why then in problem 9, it just goes back to calculating the area of a triangle, right? So if I'm thinking about here, this is where the perfectly competitive firm would choose if they face that downward sloping demand curve. So my deadweight loss just becomes the area in between demand and marginal cost for all of these units. So it's what? The height will still be, what was the difference between marginal cost and price? That was my markup. So the height of my deadweight loss triangle will still be my markup. The base won't necessarily be my excess capacity. It's the difference between the quantity that the perfectly competitive and the monopolistically competitive firm would choose under the current demands, facing the same current demands curve, right? So it's not comparing to that long run point or the minimum point of the average total cost curve. It's where would they be choosing facing the current demand. So when we were in the long run, which we know here we're not, why? Why do I know I'm not in the long run here? 2 reasons. What is the exact same in the long run, no matter what market we're looking at? Average total and my average variable cost. We have no fixed costs, right? Well, they're different here, so we must be in the short run. Also, when I'm setting the price at 60, was that above or below my average total cost? So if I set that price at 60, is that above or below my average total cost? So profits are negative if it's below. If profits are negative, what will firms do in the long run from a monopolistic competitive market? They would exit. Looks a little bit different with monopolistic competitive markets. As firms exit, what happens? What would shift here? If the same demand for the product, but there's now fewer firms, each firm would face a higher portion of demand, or we'd see the demand increases until price is exactly equal to average total cost and profits are driven down to 0. Profits are not 0 here, they're negative, so we know that this firm is in the short run. So even if I didn't give you the average variable cost curve here, because you have negative or positive profits, you know that that firm must be facing the short run. In the long run, for a perfectly competitive or a monopolistic competitive market, profits will always be 0. Okay? Now here, when we're calculating things like deadweight loss, just to reiterate, don't forget, so that markup was the height of my triangle. The difference between the quantity of the monopolistically competitive and the perfectly competitive firm was what? 18 to 26. So 8 times 50, but it's the area of a triangle, so I always need to not forget, I also need to multiply by 1/2. Okay, don't make that mistake right on the exam. When you're calculating the area of a triangle, remember, you always have to multiply by 1/2. Anytime you're calculating deadweight loss, it'll be the area of a triangle, so you always should have a multiplication by 1/2 in those deadweight loss calculations. Okay? Any questions on this one before we keep moving? Okay. We'll go here, and I think someone else had a question that I might have skipped over. Yeah. All right. So if we are looking at something that looks like this, right? So here's where if I were to give you a question without the graph and give you the equations, I'm going to be friendly. I won't give you an upward sloping marginal cost curve. I'll keep it nice and easy at a constant marginal cost because it makes it easier to draw a graph and visualize for yourself. So I've got a demand curve and I've got the firm's marginal cost. This type of, so pattern recognition goes a long way. If I've done things in class, it shows up on the practice problems, it shows up on the quiz, and it's showing up on this practice exam. And I'm guessing if we went to the other practice exam, a similar question shows up there. What do you think is probably going to be true? Shows up on the final, right? Now it's going to be different values, right? And I can change things a little bit, but if you're seeing it pop up all the time, it's likely going to pop up on the final, right? So I'm thinking here, I gave you this demand curve, which is 100 minus 2Q. We have a constant marginal cost at 40, right? So if I were to draw this out, and I'm thinking about I've got price and quantity. I've got a constant marginal cost at 40, right? My demand curve is going to start out at a quantity of 0 at what value? Quantity is 0. The corresponding price would be 2 times 0 is 0. 100 minus 0 is 100, right? So I could draw in this demand curve. Now, what will be true about marginal revenue? I always say marginal revenue is the same equation as demand. So it starts out at the same point, but it will be twice as steep. So what would twice as steep be? Negative 4Q. All right. So if this was 5, this would be negative 10. If this was 6, this would be negative 12. Marginal revenue starts at the same point, but is always twice as steep. Okay. So in this question, we're asked, what is the profit maximizing quantity? So probably on the exam, I might be more likely to maybe combine questions 10 and 11, like make it a two-parter. But there is something that's kind of a little different. If you get the first part wrong, you'd automatically get the second part wrong. So I might separate them, but I could add some additional things in. So I might think of what I could add in here along the way. So I was going to drop that. So if I'm choosing the profit maximizing quantity, what do I want to be equal to each other? Marginal revenue and marginal cost. How do I find that quantity that a single price monopolist would choose? Well, if I have my marginal revenue equation and I know my marginal cost is constant at 40, all I'm going to do is set those two equations equal to each other. Do a little bit of algebra, I would get what? Subtract 40, move 4Q over, divide both sides by 4, and I get that that quantity should be 15. Okay? Now, I could add in a question like this, and this might be a good concept to know going into the final. If that quantity is 15, well, first of all, if marginal cost is anything that's above 0, where will a single price monopolist always choose? A marginal revenue that is also, well, if it's equal to marginal cost, and marginal cost is above 0, marginal revenue would have to be above 0. If marginal revenue is positive, what do we know is true about the demand curve? We're on the elastic portion. Okay? So we're on the elastic portion of our demand curve here at that profit maximizing quantity of 15, which will always be the case for a monopolist, will always be on that will always be true for a single price monopolist. We will always be on that elastic portion of the demand curve. Now, if I asked a follow-up question, what price would this monopolist set? Well, it's kind of a problem because if I got the quantity wrong, how do I find the price? I go up to the demand curve at that quantity. So that's why in question 11, I told you assume the value you found in question 10 was instead of 15, assume it was 10, right? Because if you get this wrong, you're going to get the price wrong. So if I'm going up to the demand curve, what am I actually doing? I'm taking that demand equation and I'm plugging in that hypothetical quantity of 10, right? So if I instead were to use the correct value of 15, right? Let's just assume we were working through this problem and it wasn't on the exam, so I don't have to like start over with an assumed true value. What would the price I set be at that quantity of 15? 100 minus 2 times 15 would be a price of 70. Okay. Does that answer your question? Now, I'll throw an additional thing here because I don't think I asked you this, but I definitely could. What if I had a price discriminating monopolist? So if I have a price discriminating monopolist, perfectly price discriminating, what kind of would change in this model? Well, this twice as steep marginal revenue curve was only because I had to set a single price. What becomes the marginal revenue curve if I can perfectly price discriminate? I'm charging consumers a price that's exactly equal to their marginal benefit. So my demand curve becomes the marginal revenue for a price discriminating monopolist. Well, what did marginal cost represent? If this is a monopolist, that would be all of supply. So notice, where does the marginal revenue equal the marginal cost if I can perfectly price discriminate? That will actually be, I didn't leave myself a lot of room, the perfect price discriminating monopolist ends up at the same quantity as what? Well, this would be where supply is equal to demand, so this would also be the quantity that what market would end up at? Perfectly competitive. So if I can perfectly price discriminate, what is the deadweight loss? What is the deadweight loss of a price discriminating monopolist? If I end up at the perfectly competitive quantity, deadweight loss should be 0. What was deadweight loss if I set a single price? Well, relative to when I'm at that perfectly competitive outcome, the single price monopolist is down here. So there, with a single price monopolist, my deadweight loss is something. So relative to a perfectly price discriminating monopolist, single price monopolist, the deadweight loss will always be higher. We have some deadweight loss as opposed to none. Okay? Questions on anything I said there? Now, what can occur, I try to draw this to line up, the perfect price discriminating monopolist or the perfectly competitive market, what was true about their marginal revenue if they were to set a single price? It would have been negative. So I heard some people respond to me, they jumped a step. Marginal revenue is negative, which means the portion of the demand curve that the price discriminating or the perfectly competitive firm would end up on would actually be on the inelastic portion of our demand curve. Okay. And if we ever ended up on the point where marginal revenue is equal to 0, we would say demand is what? Unit elastic. Okay. So I'm kind of adding some things into that question, but answering the kind of question itself along the way. Okay. Any questions on this before we move on? Okay. Any other problems people want to see worked through here? Six on the practice exam? Yeah. All right. So we actually kind of already touched on this one a little bit already, but it would be good to draw this out. And there's another question where it's looking at monopolistically competitive firms, so I might actually draw that out for you as well, just to kind of compare and contrast the two. So we're looking at question 6 here, which talks about which of the following is not true in the long run. Okay. So in the long run, if I have a perfectly competitive market, I know that I'm going to end up at what point on my average total cost curve? If you were listening to me earlier, we should all be able to respond in unison. We end up at the minimum point. What hits the average total cost curve at its minimum point? My marginal cost. going back to like stuff in the last exam, this was the idea that when marginal cost is below the average, our new average is lower. The marginal cost is above the average, so it hits it at its minimum point. We know that the long run perfectly competitive firm ends up here, which means that equilibrium price that they face, which is their marginal revenue curve, hits marginal cost at that point, that minimum point of the average total cost curve. So what is going to be true in a perfectly competitive market? Well, first of all, no matter what market, we should always know that marginal revenue is going to be equal to marginal cost. Like that should be a given. That is how we make that profit maximizing decision. So I don't think there was an easy one there, but that should be true, right? Now, in the long run, where would my average variable cost curve be? Yeah, it's the exact same thing as my average variable costs, right? So right away, if I know I'm in the long run, what can I rule out right away? Well, average variable and average total should be the same thing. Now, the reason why they're this, so I know this one can't be true. I'm already done. But let's just assume I didn't give you that answer, right? In the long run, I also always know what will be true. Of perfectly competitive firms, I know that profits will be equal to 0. If profits are equal to 0, I can always remind myself using this equation, what must also always be true? If I'm producing something, in order for profits to be 0, what has to be equal to what? Price has to be equal to average total cost. And in fact, in a perfectly competitive market, price is the firm's marginal revenue. So what's going to be true? Price is equal to marginal revenue, is equal to marginal cost, is equal to average total cost, which we also know will be in the long run the minimum average total cost as well. Everything essentially is equal in the, and I could even say it's equal to what? Average variable cost. Everything is equal in the long run for a perfectly competitive market. Okay? Well, with the exception, like this isn't equal to quantity, but in terms of like all the costs and marginal revenues, those would all be the same thing. Okay? Now, does that have to be the case in the short run? Not necessarily. But I could draw out another model. Well, in the short run, let's say what has to be true there. Well, in the short run, if I had negative profit, well, perfectly competitive market, price will always be equal to marginal revenue. Marginal revenue will always be equal to marginal costs, but that price, marginal revenue, marginal cost value might now vary from my average total because I don't know that profits are 0. A lot of this hinged on the fact that I know in the long run profits are equal to 0. So in this case, I can't say whether or not price, marginal revenue, marginal costs are above or below, right? Because profits could also be positive, right? I won't be at that minimum point of the average total cost curve, so I can still say some things are true, but I can't say all of these things will be equal, right? And in fact, if I think about instead a monopolistically competitive market, what could we say there even if we were in the long run, okay? So in the long run, they instead will face this downward sloping demand curve and a twice as steep marginal revenue curve. We've got our increasing marginal costs. So here's the quantity that the monopolistically competitive firm sets. They go up to the demand curve to set the price. In the long run, we know what? In a monopolistically competitive market, in the long run, profits will be equal to, so we said firms can still freely enter and exit. So in the long run, profits still get driven down to 0, right? If profits are 0, what do we know has to be true? Price has to be equal to my average total cost, right? However, in this model, in the long run, what will also definitely be true? Well, marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, and my price is equal to average total cost. But what's part of the process to solving for where the price is? We go up to the demand curve. So these two things would always be greater than my marginal revenue and marginal cost, right? My marginal revenue and marginal cost values will always be below the current price and average total cost. Right? So I could say marginal revenue is less than price, marginal cost is less than average total cost, marginal revenue is less than, I could make any of those compare. These will be equal, these will be equal, but these are greater than this set, right? That's not quite the same as when I had a perfectly competitive market, okay? Now, what will also be true about a monopolistically competitive market, what point am I not at? If marginal cost is below average total, that means my new average total would be lower or it's decreasing. So I must not quite be at my minimum point. A monopolistically competitive market won't end up at that efficient scale of production. Okay? Any questions over anything I said there? Okay. Sorry, this is a complete aside, but it makes me insanely uncomfortable when it's okay, you guys can keep doing this, I don't care. But when you're recording me, like with your phone, it's very unnerving. And I like recently have got a string of things on my social media of like professors absolutely blowing up on students and like yelling at them, this is how you can't record. And it just made me think of that. So keep going. I don't mind. But I've seen a couple, it's not just you. I've seen a couple people do it. But I'm like the whole time I'm like getting in my head, I'm like, oh gosh, like what if mine flies down? Like what if I might end up, so but go ahead. By all means, keep doing it. But I keep seeing these on my social media. And this is where I'm sometimes like, is my phone somehow like reading my mind that like I'm seeing this and then it's showing me similar videos? But I digress, right? Back to review, okay? Any other questions that you guys kind of want to see next here? So we'll go here and then I'll come over here. Yeah. Yeah. All right. So, yeah. So we probably have touched on this a little bit. If I'm in the long run, so here I will also kind of say, similar to the other two exams, a little bit different with these practice exams. I probably didn't put as much time. You'd probably see me do things like this, either capitalize long or bold them, because like I'm trying to kind of give you signals for like what might be some key elements of this question. So a key element here would be I know I'm in the long run. So if I'm in the long run and I'm looking at this depiction, what goes away? Average, and it doesn't go away, but what does it become? Average total cost. So if I'm in the long run and I'm thinking about what would the equilibrium quantity be for a perfectly competitive firm? In the long run, where does a perfectly competitive firm end up? Minimum point of our average total cost curve. So that would be at a quantity of 300, right? If I'm following that point kind of down. And then what will my average variable cost be? Well, this is where you don't want to make the mistake of, even though I gave you this depiction, right? This is the cost structure they face, but because there's a difference between average total and average variable cost, I don't have to tell you, this is a depiction of a market that's in the short run. So in the long run, this won't be the actual visual you would use because your average variable cost would become the average total cost curve. So there, my average total cost will actually be the value of my average variable cost, which is also 300. Is that, so, and once again, I probably am lazier when I throw together these practice exams. You'll see a lot more bolding of things on the final, or like you would have seen like in the midterms where like I try to identify some things that might be key pieces of information on a question, okay? And then you were next, right? What was it about? Advertising? Yeah, so it's very similar to the one that we worked through earlier. So without drawing everything out again, let's just kind of work through this one, how we maybe go through it pretty quickly. So I didn't give you any like possible answers here, but I'm giving all this information. Right away, if I see a problem like this, the first thing I want to figure out is, are profits positive or negative? What do I need to compare? Price to average total cost. So here I've got a price of 25, average total cost of 35. price is less than average total, so I know my profits are negative. As soon as I see negative profits, I have another decision. Do I stay open or shut down? What is that decision based off of? Is my price less than average variable cost? If it is, I shut down. So is my price of 25 less than my average variable cost? Yes. So I simply shut down. If I shut down, my profits are negative what? Fixed costs. Often in a word problem, or let me see if I've got one up here. Yeah, we'll use this graph. Maybe I don't give you a word problem, but I ask you what are the profits of the firm if they're profit maximizing. So in this case, it won't quite line up with the word problem, but I'll kind of just use it to kind of give you a depiction. Let's assume that we had the same values in that bonus question. I know I should shut down. If I'm looking at a graph, I don't have to just look at the profit maximizing quantity to determine my fixed costs. I can look at any quantity, and the difference between my average total and my average variable costs times that quantity will give me my fixed costs. So at any quantity, so in this case, I could look at 10. If I take the difference between my average total and average variable costs, that would be what? 13 times 10. My profits here would have been negative 130 if I shut down, right? Because that's my fixed costs. Same kind of idea in the word problem. I'm simply looking at this quantity of 75, what's the difference between my average total and my average variable cost? That would be 7. So 7 times 75 is going to be what? Oh, 700 minus 175, so 625? No, 525. I'm doing math bad in my head. So 525, but I need to be careful. If I shut down, my profits aren't 525, they are negative 525, right? So I'm still using like the problem we did before. I'm taking that quantity I'm selling times the difference between my average total and my average variable costs. But that profit equation, when I shut down, there's always a negative sign out front. Because I know if I shut down, these are losses, right? These represent my fixed costs. So that's what I'm losing by shutting down, just my fixed costs. Okay. Just to make a point though, if I had something like this and I had a visual and asked you a similar question, well, first of all, what's the price that this monopolistically competitive firm is choosing to set? 60, right? They choose the quantity where marginal cost is equal to marginal revenue, which is 10. They then go up to the demand curve. Price is above average total, so profits are positive. So I can still calculate my profits if I shut down the same way. We said they were what? 13, or sorry, is it 13? Difference between average total, average variable cost. Yeah, 13 times 10. So what? Negative 130. If I stay open though, well, what would my profits be? The difference between price and average total cost. So here, 24 times 10. So if I stay open, my profits are positive 240. Is that better or worse than losing 130? Better. Anytime price is above average total cost, if I go ahead and actually calculate profits if I stay open and calculate my profits if I shut down, those profits from staying open would always be higher. In fact, if I had an example, I think this is just a, yeah. Let's say that I had instead the demand curve was lower and the price was something like 30 here. So if the price was 30 at that quantity of 10, should I stay open or shut down? Well, 30, that price would be below average total cost of 36, so negative profits, but it would be above my average variable cost of 23, so my profits, even though they're negative, I should stay open. If I stayed open, what would my profits be? Well, that price of 30, the difference between that and my average total cost, 30 minus 36 would be negative 6 times 10. I'd be losing $60 as opposed to when we said we shut down, we'd be losing 130. It was better to stay open. So you can just use the rule of whether price is above or below average variable cost. But if you actually go ahead and calculate, if you want to like have extra time to check yourself, You can calculate profits if you stay open, calculate profits if you shut down, and if you've done it correctly, it should line up with the same decision that you would make if you just compared price to average variable costs. Okay? So that was more than, I think, what you asked, but just to kind of paint a broader view of, you could not just have a word problem. I could also ask you similar questions using a depiction as well. Okay. Any other questions people want to see kind of work through here? Yeah. On the practice exam? All right. So, once again, pattern recognition. These problems have shown up on the practice problems, the quiz, final exam practice. Likely going to see something that looks like this on the final. Okay. So if I have a duopoly market, I've got two firms, right? How, if they were acting together to work like a monopolist, how are they going to choose the profit maximizing quantity a monopolist would set? Where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Here I gave you a nice constant marginal cost at 60. Okay. Well, I don't have my marginal revenue. How would I calculate it? So marginal revenue, anytime we calculated something on the margin, what was always in the denominator? Our change in quantity. So marginal revenue was a change in total revenue divided by a change in quantity. I could go ahead and calculate that. So here, 0 to 9,500, my changes in quantity are always 100. So 9,500 divided by 100 would be 95. Right? And then what's the change in total revenue here? 8,500 divided by a change in quantity of 100. This would be 85. Now, I could keep doing that. Because we're dealing with linear demand curves, why do I know I can always just keep, after I calculate that first marginal revenue, why can I just keep going down by 10? What represents here my demand curve? The combinations of price and quantity. So as my quantity goes up by 100, how much was my Y value price falling by? 5. Yeah, sorry, raising your hand. No, it's 5. So if the quantity goes up by 100, price is going down by 5. The slope there, right? What should be true about the slope of my marginal revenue curve? Every time I go up by 100 units, it should be falling twice as much. So instead of going down by 5, my marginal revenue curve should be going down by 10. Sure enough, it is. I mean, you can go through and calculate this to prove this to yourself, but that's what's happening, right? So once I calculate like that first marginal revenue, I know that the continuing marginal revenues will always just be going down by the same amount. Now, it might be a good idea, just in case you're thinking about this wrong, calculate the first few, and then you'll kind of be able to see how much it's falling down by. But now I've got my marginal revenue. Now, if you wanted to, it might make it easier. I can kind of look at this and I can think about it, but maybe what would make it easier to really see is if I wrote my marginal cost values down here, they would all be, I kept it constant, 60. So for those first 100 units, is the marginal revenue greater than the marginal cost? 95 greater than 60? Yes, so I produced the first 100 units. What about the next 100 units? 85 is greater than 60, so yes. Yes, yes, no. So I don't produce up to the 500th unit. They'll kind of stop here at a quantity of 400, right? Now, this is a unique example where we usually think about, I'm setting the profit maximizing quantity where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. That doesn't happen here. So really the decision is we produce as long as the marginal revenue is greater than or equal to. So if there is an equal point, we go up to that point. Here, there isn't one, right? So we continue to produce as long as marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost, but there is no equal point. So we stop at the last one where it's greater than or equal to. So they work together. They restrict quantity to 400 units. I would then go up to the demand curve, which here what's the demand curve? It's just the combinations of price and quantity. So at 400 units, what will the price in the market be? 80. So now this is where I have to be careful. Anytime we have these duopoly models, and once again, they look similar in all the examples I've given you, we have two firms. They're setting the total price in the market as if they were a monopolist. So 400 is the market quantity. If I have two firms, they split it evenly. Each firm would produce half of that, or 200 units. Now, the price they set doesn't get divided by 2, right? The price was what was causing the quantity that they could each sell to be lower at 200. So they're still going to set that same price of 80, which results in the same market quantity of 400, but each firm is going to be producing 200 units. Okay? Any questions on that idea? So if I have any positive marginal costs, what will always be true about the point where a duopolist would choose or a monopolist would choose if they were duopolist if they hold true to the agreement? Well, marginal revenue at our optimal point is what here? Positive. So we know that we're going to end up on what portion of the demand curve? Elastic. We could go all the way back to module 4 and calculate the elasticity, and it'll show us that it's greater than 1, or we just simply need to know that when marginal revenue is positive, the demand curve is elastic. Now, if they break this agreement, if I was pretty confident with my answer to 17, right away, I know that if they break the agreement and don't act like a monopolist, monopolists set the highest price and restrict quantity the most, or have the lowest quantity. So if they break the agreement, I know what's going to happen to the price. It's going to go down, and the total quantity in the market is going to go up. So right away, I could rule out the price would be 80, because I know it's going to be lower, and I know the quantity has to be higher from each firm, so I know that that has to be higher than 200. So it doesn't help me a whole lot, but at least now instead of 4 options, I know it can only be 2 here. All right? So if this instead, they break the agreement, what quantity are they going to arrive at? So we said in these duopoly market models, there's always this incentive to be the one firm that breaks the agreement. This pushes us to a new equilibrium, which instead of the monopoly quantity, ends up being the perfectly competitive quantity. So where would the perfectly competitive market end up? Where supply is equal to demand. If I have a constant marginal cost, that is my supply curve. So where does that constant marginal cost or my supply curve? Is it greater than or equal to my demand curve at these values? Well, demand is greater than, my supply curve here, greater than here, 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 all the way to this last point where the supply is now equal to my demand curve, right? So that last quantity that we would see from a perfectly competitive market would be the 800th unit, right? So if I'm thinking about a visual that goes along with this, I can switch over here. I gave you a constant marginal cost. We said the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost for a single price monopolist at 400 units at a price of 80. The point where supply or that marginal cost will equal demand now is at a higher quantity of 800. What will the price be? What's the price that's going to be set by a perfectly competitive firm? It's where supply is equal to demand, so that price would be equal to that constant marginal cost of 60. So what has happened to the price when they break the agreement? It goes down. The quantity they sell goes up. Now here's where under these duopoly models, we just have to be careful with quantity because this is the quantity of the market. Each firm produces the quantity of the market, but we only have duopoly models, so half of that. I could do like a triopoly or like quadopoly. Right? We could do like different numbers. I'm only ever going to look at duopoly markets for you, right? So here we know that the quantity would be half as much. So the kind of monopoly, if we hold true to the agreement, the quantity each firm would produce is 200. If they break the agreement, they end up producing half of the perfectly competitive quantity, which would be 400. Okay. Now, in this case, so this doesn't always have to be the case, right? if this was a perfectly competitive market, what portion of the demand curve am I on? Well, I still base it off this twice as steep single price monopolist marginal revenue curve. So their marginal revenue is still positive. So they actually still end up on the elastic portion. That can happen. Now, in the long run over time, what's more likely to be the case is firms with, we had entry and exit, profits might be, we would see something like, instead of 60, that marginal cost gets driven down. If that marginal cost was 40, now where is the new equilibrium in the market? It's at a higher quantity, marginal revenue is now negative, and the perfectly competitive market, when profits are zero, end up on the inelastic portion of the demand curve, okay? But in the short run, we could end up, even in a perfectly competitive market, where marginal revenue is, positive, and we could still end up on the elastic portion, okay? The key there is we know that if marginal revenue is positive, we're on the elastic portion of the demand curve. If it's negative, we're on the inelastic portion. Second time I've mentioned this today, might be a reason why, okay? All right. Any other questions on these two real quick here? So one thing I would want to kind of point out as well. So if instead I were to take these results and put them into a normal form game, so let's say we had something like this, right? Because we haven't touched on this today, and maybe people don't want to see a review on this, which is fine. We just won't do as much kind of next class. But let's say I have firm one, and they kind of have two decisions, right? They can set half the monopoly quantity or half the perfectly competitive quantity. So what's going to be kind of the payoffs of this game? Well, if they both set the perfectly competitive quantity, in the long run, what are profits going to be? Zero, right? Now, if one firm restricts quantity, but I produce more, as that first firm, the price, because I'm selling more units, the price is going to get driven down, which hurts my profits a little, but I'm selling way more units. So possibly I could actually have profits of something, let's say 400. But if I'm the firm that produces the lower quantity, I'm now producing a lower quantity, and now the price is getting driven lower. Maybe I'm only at like 100. Same kind of thing here. If I'm the firm that produces the monopoly quantity, I hold true to the agreement, but the other firm doesn't, the price gets driven down. I'm producing the same number of units. My profits might be only 100. The firm that sells more units, even though the price is lower, they can make up for that because they're selling way more units, and maybe the profits are like 400. Now, if we both restrict quantity and act like a monopolist, maybe we could both earn positive 300 each, right? We're keeping the price high. We're kind of restricting quantity like a monopolist would. So if I were to go through and solve this game, firm two's payoffs are always on the right. So if firm two and firm ones are always on the left. So if I think about firm one, if firm two holds true to the agreement and acts like a monopolist, what should I do? Well, 400 is greater than 300. If instead firm two chooses to act like a perfectly competitive firm, what should I choose to do? Well, here this would actually be setting the monopolist, right? My profits would be a little bit higher. Same kind of idea here. If firm one chooses that monopoly, half the monopoly quantity, what should firm two do? 400 is greater than 300. What if firm one chooses that perfectly competitive quantity? Firm two should restrict quantity as well, right? So we can have situations where we don't necessarily, from these games, have prisoner's dilemmas, right? A lot of the times I set them up in class. So this is where pattern recognition, you don't always just assume because the problem you saw on the practice final had a prisoner's dilemma Nash equilibrium. If I change the payoffs a little bit here, it's not always the case that these duopoly markets end up in a prisoner's dilemma. They can, right? But we can also have, given the cost and the demand curve, potentially end up with here, we don't have a prisoner's dilemma because the Nash equilibriums we end up at, we have multiple equilibrium. We don't know where we're going to be. But if I were here, could both firms be better off with a different combination of strategy choices? Well, if we were to go here, both firms are worse off. If I go here, one firm is better off, but one firm is worse off. And if we go over here, one firm is worse, one firm is better. This isn't a prisoner's dilemma, right? There's no other outcome where both firms could be better off. So just because you see like an example on, especially with these normal form games, where we have an example where there's one equilibrium and a prisoner's dilemma, if the payoffs are a little bit different, we can end up still in like a duopoly market where we have multiple equilibrium. So don't just like default to like, oh, this is what the answer was in the practice final. I could change them. I might change the payoffs so that the answers aren't the same as what they were on the practice final. So when it comes to like these game theory questions, we have all types of different potential answers. We can have one equilibrium. We could have multiple. There's some games where we have no equilibrium, right? We have examples where there's an equilibrium and it's not a prisoner's dilemma. We have one equilibrium and it is a prisoner's dilemma. So any of those are kind of fair game, right? There's some that happen more commonly than others, and there's some that I probably use to, introduce the idea and the concept. But all of those are possible answers, and I could change the payoff so that any of them could be the answer on the final. Okay? All right, so before I let you guys get out of here, my morbid curiosity, and I will likely mention this in my announcement after final exam grades are posted. And I also teach a stats course, so I'm kind of interested in what the correlation is going to look like. So this isn't for any points, right? This is out of the kindness of your heart that you're giving me this data. Simply responding to this question lets me know that you were in class here today, right? So the code, I think, is set to be 3,000 to kind of get you in. But it also is going to help me on Thursday's class because the question is asking, what do you want to see more review of on Thursday? Okay? So I will still ask you for questions and work on those if there's ever like some lapse in people asking a question, or I might add some things in similar to what I did today when someone asked a question and there's something I think might also be good to know. I'll kind of incorporate that in as like an addendum to us working on that question. I want to be able to do more of that on stuff that you guys want to see more review on. So module 10 was perfectly competitive markets. Module 11 was monopolies. Module 12 was our game theory, duopoly models. Module 13 was monopolistic competitive. As we go through review on Thursday, which of those modules would you like me to spend more time kind of adding these additional things in as we're working through the actual questions that you have, right? So that way I know I'm taking more of our time, making it more efficient where it has the highest marginal benefit or marginal utility to you guys of taking more of that time and focusing on the modules where a higher percent of people have questions, okay? So 3,000 was that number to get you in. Just kind of answer before you kind of leave on the way out. Thursday, once again, we'll just be doing review. I'll have that second set of practice exam questions to go as well. If you have questions on that, we can also have that open and answer stuff from there, okay? Other than that, I will see you guys on Thursday.